Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. You can follow us on iTunes, Stitcher, or TuneIn Radio, and you can contact us by giving us feedback on iTunes. Contact us on Twitter, we're podcast_init. You can email us at hosts@podcastinit.com or leave comments in our show notes. And we also recently added a Google Plus page at +podcastinit, the Python podcast. We donate our time to you because we love Python and its community. If you would like to return the favor, you can send us a donation with details on the site. Everything that we don't spend on producing the show will be donated to the PSF to keep the community alive. We're recording today on August 8th, 2015. Your hosts as usual are Tobias, Macey, and Patti. And today we are interviewing the core developers of Nikola and Pelican about static site generators. So, could you please introduce yourselves? Justin.
Certainly. My name is Justin Mayer. I lived in Japan for a while, came back to Southern California, where I'm originally from, and I design and build software here, both web applications, mobile applications. Some other things, I speak at conferences occasionally. I've spoken at PyCon, DjangoCon, Southern California Linux Expo on a variety of topics, including static site generators. Currently working on two major projects. One is monitorial.net, which is a Python-powered server security monitoring tool to help you have a better understanding as to whether your servers have the latest security updates applied and other sanity checks. And the other one is Uprise, which is spelled with two I's. And Uprise is focused on providing a better concert ticketing experience and eliminating concert ticket scalping, which of course everyone hates. Also love craft beer, good wine, traveling, and tinkering with things, whether that's keyboards or computers or really anything that I can take apart.
Excellent. Roberto, how about you?
Okay, my name is Roberto Alsina. I live near Buenos Aires in Argentina. I work for Canonical on things I am not free to discuss at this moment, so that's going to be awkward. I have been involved with Python for a really long time, have spoken at different conferences and all that stuff, have done a bunch of projects, which are all pretty much abandoned, except for Nikola at this point. But I have had a lot of fun with it, and I love the language, so I write about it and talk about it in conferences and all that stuff. Other than that, just a regular guy, nothing really interesting.
I doubt that. So how did both of you get introduced to Python?
I started using Python when I created a commerce business a few years back, importing products from Japan and other countries in Asia. And I needed a way to get the order data out of the order system into the payment processor. And then after that, into the logistics service that I was using for picking, packing, and shipping. And it was a very cumbersome process initially. I had to export things as CSV files and then figure out how to get it into the respective services, and Python made it easy for me to write a couple of scripts to do that. And it was something that I needed to automate. Python seemed like a good tool for the job, and that's how I started using it. And then I needed to publish something years later and was looking for a way of publishing things that was a little bit better suited for what I was trying to do than WordPress or Drupal or any of the other common PHP-based publishing tools allowed. And that's how I came across static site generators and Pelican. And then eventually, like I said before, that sort of parlayed into Monitorial, which uses Python across the board, everything from the agent that runs on the server to the web service that it communicates to the web application that end users log into.
Roberto, why don't you tell us how you got introduced to Python?
Okay, this is going to make me look even older than I am, but it was 1996. And I was starting to play with Linux, and I was trying to write code. I was not much of a programmer yet, not that I am now, but anyway, I was really beginning. I was beginning to program. I was really frustrated with C and C++, and I wanted to write graphic interfaces for applications. So I found something that was called Xforms, which was sort of free graphical toolkit that nobody remembers anymore. And I also hated that I had to write the programs in C. So I learned Python, and the first thing I did was write a binding from Python to this graphical toolkit, which I released and nobody used in 1996, like I said. And then I forgot all about it until 2009, when I actually tried to build it again and it still worked, which was surprising. I kept using Python for different things. I was a network administrator, so I wrote little tools, things like that. And I pretty much have not really used any other languages since then. So it has been almost 20 years, which now that I think about it is scary. And I have been working with it. I started keeping a blog somewhere around year 2000, and I always used custom things I built, and I was doing static site generators since pretty much back then. Nikola is the first one that's actually public and other people are using, so a really long, convoluted way to get here. But I basically wrote Nikola because I didn't like the other static site generators, because I couldn't import my really complicated blog I had, which inherited the path structure from software that nobody even remembers now anymore. So I wrote my own, and then I published it, and people sort of liked it, so I keep using it.
For our listeners who may not know, what are static site generators, and what are some of the advantages they bring to the table over other similar systems that perform the same function?
So basically, static site generators they remove all the effort from the computer that serves you the website. Usually websites, you read the page, and then the page is custom built for you just at that moment. It checks things with databases, it runs programs on the server, and does all sorts of things, so that in the end you end up with HTML text in your browser, right? In a static site generator, all that happens happens much earlier in the process. It happens on somebody else's computer, then the results are uploaded to the server, and that means the server already knows what you want. It will give you the static web page you really need, and that's all it's going to give you. No code runs on the server, no database runs on the server, and that means the server doesn't do much. It's really light, doesn't need a lot of resources, has a much smaller surface to have security issues, and usually works faster.
Yeah, I would highlight a number of those things. The better performance is a concern for anyone who is lucky enough to achieve some success with a particular article that they've published. If it gets picked up by a number of different news aggregators, the last thing you want is for this flood of traffic to result in server errors. So not to mention just the general performance. If it takes 10 seconds to load, you're unlikely to have folks stick around to see what the actual content on the page is. So both from a perspective of better performance and better reliability and uptime, I think static site generators offer quite a bit over their more dynamic content management system counterparts. Another significant advantage is security. When you have a static site, it's just a bunch of static assets. So you've got some JavaScript, HTML, CSS. The attack surface for someone who's trying to do something nefarious is much, much lower with a static site than with a content management system that's running on an application server that is executing instructions on every page load. The deployment and maintenance is easier. You generate your static assets, you use your preferred file transmission tool of choice to transfer those files to any number of different deployment options. You can deploy to your own virtual private server. You can deploy to GitHub, S3. There are umpteen other different deployment options that are greater than you would say have if you're tied to a particular web application stack like WordPress or some other content management system. And ongoing maintenance is easier. You might update your static site generator tool itself, but that doesn't really impact what's going on the live server. If you are, say, updating your WordPress installation and something goes awry, well, your site's now offline. That's not something that would happen with a static site generator. You might update your static site generator tool and generate your site and notice that something's wrong, but that's all happening locally. That's not happening on your live server. So it's quite a bit easier to maintain I also find that it's easier to version your content. So if you're just dealing with text files on your own system, you can store those in a version-controlled repository, whether that's Git or Mercurial or whatever your tool of choice is. And I find it much easier to version that content over time than it would be using a database-backed content management system.
And you can also version both your input and your output. When you have a website that's managed by a database, it's really hard to version the actual text that you write for your site. That's hidden in the database.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And people should be versioning both the source content and the generated output. Because if you were to update your tool and you were to accidentally deploy changes to your production environment that you didn't really intend to, or you've later found included some problems that you wanted to revert to, it's much easier to make that reversion if you have your output version as well. And just the last couple of things that I'll say about the advantages of a static site generator are, you're dealing with just files. So to me, it's just a simpler thing to deal with. You have files on the input side, you have files on the output side. And it kind of adheres a little more closely, I think, to the Unix philosophy of files, as opposed to having to interact with a database that you have to back up and manage. And it's a lot less overhead in general. And the last thing I'll mention is you have better control over your own data. When you have all of your content in files sitting on your system that you are pushing somewhere else, you always have the most recent updated version of your content because it's on your system to begin with. That's where it originated. That's where it was generated. That's where it was transferred from. If you're making all of your changes on a remote server, you have to remember to try to periodically extract and back up and pull that data someplace where you have a little bit more control over it. So I think just having better control over your own data is a pretty significant advantage for static site generators.
Absolutely. Simply not having the requirement of a database is such a huge difference. I mean, that's kind of one of the things that drove me away from WordPress and towards a static site generator is the fact, a number of the things you mentioned, but the thing that broke the camel's back for me was the fact that it was so hard with WordPress to manage all the complexity, like PHP gets updated and now suddenly something doesn't work, or as you said, you have a database to take backups of and worry about security of, and it's definitely a huge relief when you realize the only thing you need running on your sort of publicly hittable node is your web server of choice, and that's it. No CGI needs to run at all, in fact. It's a liberating feeling, actually.
Absolutely. It's the curse of software is complexity. It's complexity that generally introduces the problems that we face on a daily basis. The problems related to speed, performance, problems related to reliability and uptime, problems related to security. These are all problems that are in large part caused by complexity. And when you have a simpler tool, it's much easier to manage those inherent risks in software. And it sounds like something that drew you to it. And I think that that's a large part of its popularity over time is that simplicity.
Yeah, and I'll also say that going back to both performance and simplicity, because it's just static files, it also makes it much simpler from a caching standpoint, where you can just put a CDN in front of your, wherever you're hosting your site. And even if your site actually goes down, because everything is just static assets, it's very simple for a CDN or a caching system to just display the site as it would have been had you actually gone back to the source. And it can also significantly reduce the amount of load that needs to be supported by your server, which means that you can spend less money on a hosting solution.
That's absolutely right. Those are all very significant advantages for someone who's interested in dealing with some of the slightly less than user-friendly aspects of static site generators, which is another topic in and of itself.
And the other advantage as well, going back to your point about ownership of your data, is that it prevents vendor lock-in, because since all of your content is just in static files and usually written in either markdown or restructured text or some other form of simple markup, it really makes it a lot easier to take that content and move it to a different tool chain and not have to deal with any potential data loss in the migration or issues with incompatibilities between your source and destination systems, because all it is just text.
That's right. You could always point wget at a WordPress site, for example, and have it pull down all of the generated HTML and JavaScript and CSS, and then take that and then, in theory, upload it someplace else. So there are ways of migrating other things, but I agree that it's really not a one-to-one comparison. It's much, much easier to migrate something that's a static site to begin with. There are issues with using sort of a blunt force tool like wget to mirror the contents of a site.
If you try to migrate a WordPress site that way, you're going to end up with uneditable files, because you download a post and it's going to be the whole page. It's going to have all the Chrome around it, all the decoration, all the sidebars and all that stuff. And in fact, most of that is going to be broken anyway after you move it to another site. You cannot actually edit that anymore. It's just a read-only copy, and it's not the same thing. When you have literally markup for your posts and your pages and so on, moving from Nikola to Pelican is probably going to take 5 minutes for a normal site. It's mostly going to be about how do I get the metadata for the post, like tags and categories and such, and move them to the place the other software wants them. But it's really just a scripting thing. It's not a big problem. I have written the code to import from WordPress, and trust me, it's not easy, even using a dump, because it's not documented anywhere. Even the format of the input of WordPress changes after you install plugins. So you have a plugin, and now the input for your WordPress is different from every other WordPress installation in the planet, and no other WordPress can read it unless they have the exact same combination of plugins, which is incredibly frustrating when you try to get code outside of it. There's a lot of luck in that sort of system.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There are a lot of issues revolving around WordPress import. We see people ask questions on the Pelican issue tracker regarding WordPress import, and oftentimes we are ill-equipped to assist because we have long since left WordPress and its ilk behind. So we have to rely on the community to try to help out with a lot of those questions. And yeah, Roberto, you're absolutely right. It is not, it's not well documented. WordPress is not something that's easy to interact with. And yeah, vendor lock-in really is a very significant point in terms of trying to choose what tool you're going to use to publish. Vendor lock-in is something that people certainly should consider.
Yeah, that's a big reason why when I was first starting up my blog and also the website for this podcast, I decided to go straight for a static site generator, just start writing some content and SCP it up to my Linux server, and there you go. So there are a number of static site generators available in virtually every programming language that somebody would be wanting to use. Why would a user want to leverage a Python solution versus Ruby, JavaScript, Go, or what have you?
I think that folks who are already interacting with a particular programming language, whether it's Python or Ruby or Go or JavaScript or Rust or Nim or any other language that they might be excited about, that's always a good choice. It's the reason that I originally sought out a static site generator that used Python as is the language that it's implemented in, was so that if I decided that it didn't do something that I wanted it to do, then I'm better equipped to extend it to make it do that thing that I want it to do. So just to use Pelican as an example, I found that it did not apply certain typographical enhancements in the output when I first started using it. So things like curly quotes, things like taking a double hyphen and turning them into an M dash, ligatures, widows and orphans. And there's umpteen different things like that typographical nerds like myself are somewhat fixated on in terms of when I'm looking at generated output. So I submitted a pull request to add that particular feature. So I don't know that there's too many things that are specific to Python that make it, sort of heads and shoulders a better solution for a static site generator than any other language. Obviously, there are a lot of libraries. So for example, the typographical enhancements that I'm talking about, I was able to leverage a library called Typography in order to do that. I didn't have to write that myself. So library availability would be a factor. If you're, say, trying to use Nim or Rust or some relatively less mature or newer language, you're going to have a more difficult time finding those types of libraries to extend the tool to make it do what you want it to do. But that would be probably the only thing I can think of. Roberto, can you think of any other things that are sort of specific to Python that make it a great language for a static site generator?
Okay, yeah. I have one specific. It's something that was something I wanted. I have always been a big fan of restructured text, and that means Python. There is another implementation of it, which is in Haskell. So you have to choose Python or Haskell, and to me that was an easy choice because I know Haskell. So, in fact, in Nikola, we try to support as many markups as we possibly can, and Python is really good at that because we have restructured text, we have 6 implementation of Markdown around, we have text style, text to tags, and so on and so forth. There's an absurd number of markups, and that's important because people can then write in whatever they actually feel comfortable writing with. In my case, that was restructured text, and that meant Python.
That's a very good point of the markup support because, as you said, you prefer restructured text. Some other people may prefer Markdown, and having good broad support for various markups does make Python a very good target for that. I know that in Ruby, some of the static site generators there use Haml as the markup language because it's something that's been popularized as an add-on for the Rails framework. So the language affiliation definitely can make an impact on what you actually have as an option for writing your content. So that's a very good point. Hadn't thought about that.
I suppose there is a parallel static site generator somewhere that uses Pod or whatever. We just never heard about it.
Certainly.
Yeah, that's a good point. Another markup format is AsciiDoc, which is a Python-based library, and that's easier for, obviously, if you're writing a static site generator to support AsciiDoc if you're using a Python-based static site generator as opposed to Ruby or some other language.
Yes, but sadly, AsciiDoc in Python is sort of dormant, and all development right now is done in something that's called AsciiDoctor, which I think is written in Ruby. So.
Oh, interesting.
Sucks because AsciiDoc is very nice.
Well, I suppose that gives our listeners something to work on to improve the Python ecosystem. So it seems that most static site generators have a primary focus on blogging. What is it about these tools that lend themselves so well to that use case?
My take on this question is that it's the people that are writing static site generators are the ones that shape what the tool is focused on. So I think most folks who are building static site generators are most interested in scratching their own itch, and most of the time that itch happens to be publishing chronological content, writing articles. It's not so much I want to publish a site that has an about page and maybe a contact page and maybe some photos of my cats. I think that that's much less common than someone who says, well, I want to publish a site that has articles and people can come and read those articles. And so because that's what the people who are building these tools are interested in doing, I think that that's why you see that sort of focus on chronological content and articles. I don't know that there's anything specific, both in obviously in Nikola's case, as well as Pelican and a lot of other static site generators. There are almost always ways of producing sites that have zero chronological content and are entirely focused on creating pages in any type of hierarchy that people generally want to do. What do you think about that, Roberto?
I think part of the reason for this is that static site generators are mostly popular among programmers, and programmers are much more likely to have a blog, even if they only update it occasionally, than other people. Also, the programmers are sort of fanatic about workflow and optimization of their workflows. And that means that they really appreciate what happens because how do you work on a program? You start a branch or whatever, then you write code, then you commit, then you push, then you release. And static site generator has pretty much the same workflow. You start a post, you write in it, you build it, and then you release it. It's more or less the same thing. The workflow is really programmer-like. And that's probably also why we have so many static site generators, because as we all know, programmers like to rewrite things. We always think that we can do it better than everybody else. So we start a new static site generator just for our site. I think that's mostly why this happens. And then we also get a lot of requests about sites that are not blogs, because then we have to write sites for our programs. So they also need a site, and that's not a blog. But yeah, I think a lot of the feature set of static site generators is forced by the audience, which is still at this point mostly programmers.
Yeah, and I'll add too that I think part of what lends static site generators so much to the blogging use case is that because they're generally focused around a repeatable task of generating the site in the same manner every time, and most of the time you're not going to be iterating that many times on a content page or an advertising page, whereas in a blog you're constantly creating new pages, and so having that workflow of being able to add those pages in a repeatable and consistent manner is more well suited to blogging than it is to just creating a landing page, for instance.
Yeah, there are still advantages to using a static site generator to even for a site that doesn't include any blogging or chronological articles. So as an example, the use of templates is really one of the key points of value, I think, for a static site generator. For example, if you have a header, a footer, a sidebar, something that's supposed to be consistent across pages, using templating systems like Jinja, for example, or Mako, or other non-Python based templating systems, you can create the layout for those elements and change them in one place. If you were, say, to have even only 5 pages and you thought to yourself, well, I'll just do this using HTML and I don't need a static site generator, it's only 5 pages, you might find very soon that when you have to modify something in a footer across 5 different pages 5 times, that process gets old and tiresome and tedious very quickly. And that's one of the advantages that using a static site generator offers, is because it is built on top of that templating system to begin with.
I suspect if somebody is doing that by hand in HTML, he's still using a static site generator as a really crappy one. That's himself and his text editor, and he should get a better one. Mostly nowadays, when somebody starts doing a site, even if it's just 5 pages, he's going to go to a CMS, which is, I don't know. To me, person doing a static site generator makes little sense. But to somebody, hey, let's just throw a WordPress instance somewhere and log in and write 5 pages and be done. Install a theme. And for them, it makes sense. It takes 20 minutes to do that. So, it's all about workflows. People work differently and they make different compromises based on what they want to do and how they feel comfortable doing it.
Well said.
So something that struck me comparing the two systems is that they have largely the same kinds of data going into the metadata block for each post, but it's expressed in a different and incompatible way in each. Have you ever considered agreeing on a standard and even advertising it as such, so all static site generators could make use of it? And this plays into your vendor lock-in point from before.
It's an intriguing idea. At first, I was trying to work through the idea and see, how that would work. And it is an interesting concept. It is a little challenging because it does require coordination across, obviously, a very wide range of tools. Not that you would have to start out with every tool using it, of course. But trying to build consensus in general is a challenging thing to do. And when you have this many different tools, they tend to do things in their own idiosyncratic way because they're, like Roberto said, trying to solve the particular needs of the person who implemented it. But it's an intriguing idea, and I would certainly be interested in exploring it. I think that just as a caveat, I would say that it's useful in a rather limited set of circumstances. If you think about the use cases, it would generally be if someone is migrating from one tool to another. And not to say that that never happens, and not to say that it wouldn't be nice if it were easier to do that. I can see that would indeed be a nice thing to have. The question for me becomes, is the benefit that accrues for that particular use case worth the amount of coordination and logistical challenge to have such a standard and to get people to agree to it? But it is an intriguing idea.
Yeah, it is. There is some parts of this that could be done rather easily, like, for example, how we express metadata for posts and pages in the files, that sort of thing. That's not all that difficult to do. There is a different problem about how that gets built into a site because, for example, some tools try to reflect the file structure, the directory structure of the input in the output, and some don't. Some build based on the metadata, like if a post has a category, it goes into whatever / the category name / the post net title, etc. So you won't end up with the same site, even if we agreed on how the input works. But I think agreeing on how metadata is expressed on the input files, that's not all that difficult to do. But the problem is, suppose I write a standard for it and I propose it, then nobody's going to adopt it. They will see no benefit on doing that, I suspect.
I just want to give you just a little quick background as to why I asked the question. I asked the question because I'm currently using Pelican for my blog, and I've kind of been playing with using Nikola as well, and they're both great systems, and I don't know whether I'm going to switch, but I thought to myself, how amazing would it be as an end user if I could just take my body of posts and no matter which static site generator I used, just be able to treat my posts as portable data sets that could be moved from one to the other without change. And even if everybody supports a common subset of metadata items, right? And because of the idiosyncrasies and the way everybody solves problems differently, it's okay if it comes out differently, given the same set of data, which static site generator you run. But it was just a thought that it would be nice to not have to necessarily undertake a conversion and just be able to take the same data set and move it anywhere I wanted. That's what I was thinking of. Perhaps that's an unrealistic thought, but it occurred to me, it's partially because of Jeff Atwood there. He made a post a while ago basically saying, hey guys, why is it that we have 19 different incompatible versions of the Markdown spec? It's kind of crazy. Why don't we just all agree on some basic defaults and have a unified Markdown syntax that could be used everywhere? And it kind of never happened, but it just kind of got me thinking, wouldn't it be great if the same held for not just Markdown, but metadata as well?
You convinced me. I'll do it. I'll make Nikola accept Pelican files for him. You will have it by... What's today? It's Monday? Come back to me on Thursday.
Wow, that's very cool.
No, that's what I call service. And I'll also add that having the capability of, as Chris mentioned, just having a common subset of metadata that's supported across multiple different generators really facilitates the process of experimentation and exploration in being able to run different static site generators against the same content so you can see what the workflows are like, what the templating systems provide as options, and then being able to make your decision based on that rather than just having to read through the feature list of all of the different umpteen static site generators and say, well, I think this one fits my needs, so I'm going to go with that one. And then having, a very lightweight vendor lock-in, but it still locks you in a little bit just from the inertia of having to take the time to add or modify the metadata of your posts so that you can do that experimentation process. So that's excellent to hear, Roberto, that you are going to accept Pelican's metadata formats in your system.
I think it's a wonderful goal to have, in terms of having that kind of portability. There are some inherent challenges given that different static site generators often will use different formats for metadata. So for example, there are some Ruby-based tools that use YAML as their post metadata format. So even if you were to agree, say, on the keys that are used, things like title, date, summary, etc., the format of the metadata itself can be different enough that standardization becomes nigh on impossible. But I think that in this particular case that we're talking about, given that both Nikola and Pelican both use the Python markdowns implementation of metadata, that it wouldn't be too awfully difficult for tools that are using Python markdown, that are using that particular library, to say, let's try to agree on a common set of metadata keys, things like tags, categories. Pelican uses one called draft, which basically means, is this post a draft? And if it is, treat it differently than a non-draft post, so that it doesn't actually get published to to your site. But it would be nice. So Roberto, if you're up for it, I would love to have a follow-up conversation where maybe we could talk about ways in which we could make that portability a little bit more, make that more feasible.
Basically, Nikola doesn't have a fixed set of metadata fields. You can put anything there, but we use the basic stuff like tags, category, title, that sort of thing, date. So it should not be really difficult. Luckily, a couple of months ago, I made that a plugin, so I can just replace it with another one, override it, and then it reads Pelican posts. It's probably not all that hard. I can, like I said, give me a few days. I have ample free time at lunch.
Yeah, and that's great for interoperability, between the two. But I think that there's this very interesting, broader point, which is if there are other tools out there that use the same format for metadata, it would be nice if we had some common agreed upon. So yeah, I would be interested in exploring that. So I think that's I'm glad that you guys brought it up.
You know how you find what's the common parts of the metadata, right? You try to use the metadata from the other guy in your program, and then the parts that you can use, that's the common part. So I will know what the common part is in a couple of days.
Sure. So Pelican also allows the ability for people to put in whatever arbitrary metadata that they want into their posts. So that's just part of the underlying Python Markdown library. And any keys and values that are put into that metadata can be used on the template side of the equation to perform whatever type of related operations you want to do. But there are things that where the tool behaves differently. So like I said before, with whether it's draft or whether it's tags or categories, there are certain things that Pelican does look for. And if we could find a way of standardizing those kinds of commonly used keys, that would be really a really interesting idea.
Yeah, let's do it.
So the themes in Pelican and Nikola have very different feels, and one of the things that initially drew me to Pelican is the larger catalog of themes available. What are some of the challenges involved in creating a theme for a static site generator? And as a tie-in to this discussion of compatibility, what are some of the challenges that could be overcome in terms of making a theme that could be used among either both Nikola and Pelican, or even maybe against other site generators, as long as they're using the same templating system?
Basically, a theme takes a bunch of things that's called the context.
Mm-hmm.
And a static site generator provides, each one provides completely different things there. Standardizing that would be 10, 50 times harder than standardizing the input format. For example, we have like magical things that you write link ://tag/tag name, and it will link to the tag name, and that's not going to work anywhere else because something I came up when I needed it. It's totally just random. there is no design behind it, and I suspect most other SSG have the same sort of thing. I don't expect that's doable. The main reason why we have few themes is that I suck at HTML. Most of the latest themes have been done by other people, and the few I've done, I just took another theme from another SSG and stole it. And it's rather easy. I mean, I can steal any theme in probably about half an hour nowadays. I have practice. I just take the output, split the HTML in pieces, and make it into a template. It's not difficult.
Well, Roberto, as opposed to saying you steal it, why don't we just say that you are proactively adopting successful themes used in other projects? We all build upon the backs of giants, right?
Oh yeah, I keep credit. No, I don't really steal it. Come on. I only take things where the license allows me to, take it and change it and do it my own. But yeah, that's the main thing. I mean, Nikola is already a pretty old thing. It has 3 years. It's 3.5 years old. And I don't like that we have so few themes. But the main reason is that we don't have much in the way of actual web people working on it. And that's mostly why we have few themes.
I agree with that. That's exactly what I was going to say, is that if you look at the types of people who build static site generators and the types of people who are most interested in using static site generators, these are, shall we say, terminally minded folks, people who are comfortable using a terminal, people who are comfortable typing in arcane commands into a command line. And this is a very different type of person, generally speaking, than someone who spends a lot of their time thinking in more, shall we say, artistically creative ways. I just think there are different skill sets. And so the other part of it, aside from different skill sets, is motivation, particularly if you're talking about the person, actually in either case. People want to publish their content. Their goal for either creating or using a static site generator is that they have this content and they want to publish it. And they want to do it as easily and as painlessly as possible within reason. And I think that the idea of saying, okay, well, in addition to creating and or learning how to use a particular tool, I'm going to also craft a brand new theme. I think that most people, that's just a bridge too far. And they're more interested in utilizing a theme that someone else has created. And so when you have like 98% of people interested in utilizing the themes that the other 2% have created, you sort of end up with this somewhat of a less large a catalog as perhaps the particular ecosystem might want. But to answer the underlying question, it's not that themes are all that difficult to create. It's just a question of, like Roberto said, taking your page and dividing it into its different components and then splitting that into different template files. But that also assumes that you have a page that you really like and that you understand how the design elements work and you understand, what would be involved, like how you would break it up into the different components. And I think that there's just enough friction there. It's not a huge challenge, but it's enough to get people to say, I think I'll just use something that someone else created.
Guilty as charged.
Yeah.
I think we all are.
Yeah, basically, I started sort of an initiative to get a new theme in Nikola because I hated the ones we were shipping. And what I did was exactly that. I went, I think, to Octopress, and I found one that I liked. It was called Lanyon, and I totally copied it. And it works exactly the same. But yeah, I don't like doing web pages. It's weird to say that when you're writing a program to make web pages, but I don't.
It's a common sentiment, and it's funny that you mentioned Lanyon. A member of the Pelican ecosystem contributed a version of Lanyon for Pelican as well. I mean, it's a very nice looking theme that comes from, the Jekyll universe, and I think that that's a very common approach. Someone who sees something that they like and says, "Oh, that would be cool if it existed for my tool of choice," and at that point, it's not too difficult because the creative work's already done, and they just have to do a little bit of the shoehorning into the format that the particular tool expects. And it's something that's an issue, I think, for a lot of different tools. And it would be just going back to this question of would it be possible to create a cross tool theme standard, for lack of a better word? I agree with Roberto's assessment. If having post metadata standardization is hard and challenging, themes are going to be that much harder. They're just architected in such a way that they're very peculiar and in particular to the underlying tool. And it's not impossible, but I think it would be very challenging to do that.
Yeah, I recently decided that I want to try and create a new theme from scratch. And like you said, having to do all the creative work right up front and figure out, okay, these are all the different elements that are going to be on the page. This is how it's going to be structured. Coming as a non-designer, somebody who's, as you said, very much terminally focused, it's just so much of a different portion of your brain and thought process that you have to employ that so far I've had a couple of false starts. And one thing that I can say is that as far as trying to think of an approach to simplify that is, I know that with Pelican, you can just override the base theme incrementally. And I believe Nikola has the same capability as well. And so that's going to be my approach going forward, is because particularly using a templating engine, when you're starting from scratch and you're trying to just design, for instance, the frame of the landing page, trying to include all of the different templating syntax and account for the various metadata elements that might be included, it gives you a hindrance in being able to get started, because since you're starting from scratch, because you're not overriding things to begin with, it prevents you from being able to actually create the page and see what your results are so far. And so I think that starting from those base templates and just overriding things incrementally will be a much better approach, because then you do have the capability of, okay, I'm going to generate the page, see what actually resulted from these changes, and then just keep going in that manner.
Right. One of the things that, just as an interesting anecdote, Alexei was the person who originally created Pelican back in 2010. And just to show you sort of someone who's creating a static site generator and who's trying to decide how they want the styling to work, he came across a post from 2009 in Smashing Magazine and said, "Oh, I like this design," and essentially repurposed it as as sort of the design for the site that he was trying to create for himself. And to this day, that's the default theme in Pelican until we replace it with something different at some point in the future. But to me, it's very telling that this is the sort of way in which even tool designers and builders approach things. They find something that they like and say, well, I'll just use that rather than trying to handcraft something myself.
The default theme for Nikola was an absolutely horrible theme I had on my personal website until we replaced it with Bootstrap, which is like the worst idea ever, because every site looks like Bootstrap. And we still have that one as default now. I hope I can replace it with something decent.
So perhaps we can put the call out to our listeners that if anybody out there is a Python developer, or even not a Python developer, but maybe listening to the podcast, who has some design skills, maybe help these folks out and write some excellent looking themes for these static site generators so we can have our cake and eat it too.
And also improve the adoption of Python as the best tool for everything under the sun.
Excellent. Very well said.
So Pelican and Nikola seem to be the most widely used projects for creating static sites using Python. What do you think is the key to that popularity?
It's funny when I think about this question. I had originally, when I was searching for a static site generator, this was back in 2011, I believe. And at that time, there was still a very decent number of static site generators, nothing compared to the number today that's probably an order of magnitude higher. But at that time, and I still have this document that I used in terms of jotting notes down, like, okay, well, there's this tool, and I wrote little notes next to each tool so that I could come back to it later and try to make a decision as to which tool I wanted to use. And this was even before. Roberto, I don't think you had written Nikola at this point, so it's not in my list.
Probably not.
And so, one of the items that was on there was Pelican, and it says, I'm actually looking at my document. It says updated frequently, many contributors, good documentation. And to me, I mentioned that only because I think those are the reasons why these tools are so popular. I think that anyone who's trying to make this evaluation, right? Even though, as we mentioned before, your ease of migration, your data portability, your lack of vendor lock-in is improved using a static site generator, there's still this feeling that if I choose a tool and then I decide that there's this other tool that I'd rather use, I'm going to have to do a lot of work. And that's probably true to some degree. And so people have this feeling of, well, I want to try to choose wisely. And I think that some of the things that people look for when they're trying to make that determination is, how active is the development? How many contributors are there? What does the ecosystem look like in terms of extensibility, plugins, and themes? I think that the documentation is key, and Nikola in particular has excellent documentation. I think Pelican, we could do better in that regard. But I think at the time, Pelican had the best documentation of any tool that I could come across. You could actually look at the quick start and you could get up and running. And I think that that's part of the reason why these tools, both Nikola and Pelican are popular. A lot of it comes down to just how quickly can I get up and running? I just as another anecdote, I had used a tool prior called Hide, which was written as sort of a counterpart to Jekyll, a Python-based static site generator. And at the time, it wasn't maintained very well. But the main issue that I had with it is that I could not, for the life of me, figure out how to do very basic things with it because the documentation just was not adequate. And so I think that the documentation really is key.
I think the most important thing is that the user should be able to get a site working with something he wrote in it in 2 minutes. If he cannot do that, he's going to try something else. In the Nikola documents, I wrote something that I'm not sure is a good idea or not, but I don't want to remove it, which is the first thing the document says. It gives you like 5 commands. Install it, then run Nikola init, Nikola whatever, and then try to use it. And do not read the documents. If you need to read the documents, then the software is wrong. You should be able to get it working with just knowing 3 basic things about it. And if you can't, then it has to improve. I still make the effort to write the documents, but I would much rather the user don't need the documents. I have completely failed at that until now, but I still have hope. And you can actually do interesting things without reading them. In any case, I think that really short ramp up is the key thing, because people are going to run away from your software. If they are going to run away from it, they are going to run away from it before they are invested in it. If they already invested 2 days configuring it and creating a theme and writing posts and whatever, then they are locked in at least a little bit. And then you have a user. It may not be a happy user, but you have a user. That first impression is the key thing to keeping users.
Yeah, and I think that the extensibility is another key component. Having a wide variety of plugins and themes, I think, is something that is useful for folks who are trying to, particularly plugins. I mean, as long as you can find a theme that you are satisfied with, you're for the foreseeable future, you don't really need to do anything further regarding that. But as you use a particular tool and you start to publish additional types of content, perhaps you might find that you want to do something that the tool doesn't do. And if the tool wasn't built for extensibility in mind, if it doesn't have a wide range of existing plugins, you might find that the thing that you want to do is more difficult, and you can always write your own if the tool is made to be extensible in the first place. But if someone has written a plugin that already does what you want it to do, then all the better. You don't have to spend the time to learn how to write a plugin and implement that functionality yourself. So I think that extensibility in terms of the modularity of the tool, as well as the availability of those components, plugins and themes, is another key reason for the popularity of both Nikola and Pelican.
Totally agree. Writing plugins should be as easy as possible because everybody wants something that the tool doesn't do yet, and they can either write it themselves or just going to have to ask developers for it. And if the plugins are easy to write, it's more likely that they will do it. Actually, I am surprised. At some point, I did some statistics on Nikola, and we had this was a long time ago, we had 100 sites working with Nikola, and we had 45 contributors to the code base because everybody found things that Nikola didn't do, and they added those things. Nowadays, that has slowed down a lot because it already does a lot of things. But yeah, extensibility and an easy path into the code base are really important.
So a lot of people have written about the importance and difficulty of writing and maintaining good documentation in open source projects. Nikola's documentation is excellent. How did Nikola manage this in its development process, and what can other open source projects learn from this?
I write a lot. There's no secret to documentation. You just have to write it, and then you have to keep it updated. It takes time, and nobody likes to do it, but I do it anyway. That's the sad version of things.
I guess the answer is you are Nikola's author, and so it falls to you. It's not like you have a huge cast of characters who are working on Nikola's core that you have to get to write documentation.
There is... Basically, Nikola nowadays is written by about 3 or 4 people. Mostly me, Chris Warwick, Steven Alexanderson. He does a lot of things. He's the one that knows HTML, so I want to keep him happy. And I am the one that writes most of the docs because I don't hate writing docs. I do that a lot. And I want it to be documented. So if I want it to be documented, I need to write it. That's how it works. I'm not going to reject a branch because it doesn't have documentation. So I need to add it.
Justin, do you have anything to say on good documentation? Because as you mentioned, and as Tobias mentioned, Pelican has some great documentation as well.
I think that looking at how a user approaches your tool for the first time without the usual perspective that you have as someone who interacts with the tool on a daily basis is particularly difficult just in general for anybody. So being able to say, what is it like to use this tool as a first-time user who knows nothing about it? That's something that's difficult for people to do who spend all of their time working with it. You become so used to the rough edges, you just take certain things for granted. And to the extent that you have an ability to say, okay, I'm going to try to put all those things out of my mind and approach this as if I were a first-time user. To the extent that you can do that, that's fantastic. That's wonderful. It's very hard to do, but I think that it's a good first step. It's a good way of approaching the question of documentation to begin with. And then having a open forum for people to suggest improvements is another useful tool. I think that it doesn't happen as often, perhaps, as one might like. We will receive pull requests that say, I found this particular thing confusing and think that it should be clarified. That's much more common than someone says, I found this particular part of the documentation confusing, and here's a pull request that adds some additional language to potentially make it less confusing. That does occur, just not at the same frequency as someone who is saying, I found this confusing. You guys should fix it. But I think that at least encouraging people, and when that does happen, by the way, we will often ask them, hey, if you don't mind, would you consider perhaps submitting a pull request to clarify? Because we don't know which part of it they found confusing, and we don't know in what way they might find it less confusing. So if they're saying, I think that this particular section could be improved, okay, well, how could it be improved? And if they can help out with that, that makes the job easier for everyone, because we don't have to try to read their minds and try to sort of pull out of them what it was that they found confusing and what it is that they think could be improved. So encouraging people to help out with it, I think is a really good policy just in general. And the more you can do to take advantage of the community that kind of rises up around a particular tool to assist with documentation improvements, it's a good way to approach it.
So, what are some specific examples of unique and interesting uses your site generators have been put to?
Well, it's funny. I just from the perspective of the types of experiences that sometimes I have just interacting with the web in general, I have found interesting. So, I think, I can't remember, but it was probably 2 years ago or so, I came across the website for the Linux kernel, which is at kernel.org, and found that they use Pelican to publish that site. And I thought, well, that's really cool. I know this is, perhaps not exactly what the question was designed to elicit, but I just found it interesting that not only the types of unique and interesting uses, but also the types of organizations that use it. Like Debian uses it as well for their news site. Chicago Linux Users Group, the translation solution called Transifex, and they use, if you go to docs.transifex.com, you can see that they also use Pelican. So I just find that that's kind of interesting, is the types of places that it shows up in the wild. In terms of unique and interesting uses, I think one of the things that fascinated me was the concept of embedding Jupyter notebooks, which I guess used to be called IPython notebooks, into posts. So you can have, actual, sort of Python code, in your content that's supposed to be static. It's really interesting the types of things that you can do when you have, again, going back to this concept of an extensible ecosystem. Folks will write all kinds of interesting things, like the ability, if you look at the Liquid Tags plugin for Pelican, you'll see that it has support for a number of different things, including Jupyter notebooks. Things like math rendering. So if you want to talk about calculus or some other type of math notations or equations, you can embed those things in posts. Barry Stein is a contributor that's written a render math plugin that I think uses MathJax. And as I don't have that particular use case, so I'm not very well versed in it. But I think it's interesting that folks have created these kinds of plugins to do that. Michael Lutzfield wrote a site search plugin so that you can use JavaScript to search your own site. You don't have to rely on Google or some of these other things that, again, are outside your control of your own data. So I thought that was a really interesting implementation. And the last thing that I'll throw out is, and this is not really specific to static site generators, but it's interesting the types of things that you can kind of put together with them. Like you can add interactive elements to things that are built by static site generators. You can add contact forms. You can add subscribe me to your newsletter. Sometimes those interactive elements are in the form of embedded JavaScript includes that sort of pull in that interactive component or element from an external source. And sometimes it can be a simple thing that you build yourself. For example, I wanted to have a contact form for a variety of different things that I've done, including monitorial. And so the ability to create a single page Python application that you run that accepts the input from a contact form and then passes it on either to you via email or or to some other way of tracking those contact points. There are ways of adding that, whether you, like I said, whether you use some external JavaScript include or whether you write a single page Python app that just does something as simple as listens for the contact form submission. There's all kinds of ways of adding interactive elements to something that is supposed to be inherently static.
So Roberto, how about you? What kinds of really unique things have people put Nikola to?
I have a few good ones, but he mentioned them already. I'm really jealous that you get big profile sites like Debian and that sort of thing. We don't yet. I am really happy about how many sites I see using Nikola that are scientific sites. For example, professors and students and graduate students, that sort of thing, where they need a place where they can post papers and Jupyter notebooks and that sort of thing. And Nikola gives them a tool to do it easily. Basically, we have a Jupyter notebook supporting core. So you set up Nikola, you throw a notebook inside it, and it will just work and appear as if it were an HTML page. And people really like that. It's used a lot. That was done by Damian Avila. I am really happy that he did it. There is a bunch of interesting astronomy and things I have no idea what they are, because they are in fields of science that I know nothing about, like chemistry and that sort of thing. And also a lot of math, which is something that makes me really happy because I am a frustrated mathematician. And I'm really happy about that because it's something that is poorly served by the traditional CMS blog market, so to speak. So it makes me really happy. And also because, and this is one advantage of SSGs that I didn't mention at the beginning of the show, which is that the output is forever. Once you build a site with Nikola or Pelican or whatever, you get the output, you put it in a website, and it's going to get picked up by the Internet Archive, and it's going to be there forever. So it's not going to be lost, which for science publications and that sort of thing is especially important. In fact, we have a plugin that every time you deploy something, it tells the Internet Archive to go and get it, so that it gets archived immediately. So that's something that makes me really happy, because I have seen how much knowledge is lost because of sites that go away. And I feel that Nikola and other SSGs do a good job of preserving that knowledge forever, and that's cool.
Absolutely. I think you're right. And I think that organizations like Archive Team are a really great example of how people come to the realization of, oh my goodness, I've just invested man years of time into writing posts for Posterous or whatever other sites, that large sites that just end up going away, and then you've lost everything. And
file with an unknowable XML file in it, and you have to rebuild it somewhere else.
Exactly. Yeah, that is definitely a drag, to say the least, and that is definitely a really huge feature of these static site generators. So Nikola's flexible deployment architecture, specific example being the use of do-it tasks, seems to lend itself to some interesting use cases. What was the inspiration for that?
I saw do it, and my website was taking like an hour and a half to build. So I said, you know what? It may be a good idea to only build the parts that are needed. And do it is really cool software, and it does incremental rebuilds really easy. And that was the first feature Nikola had. Even before it could actually build websites, it could build them by pieces and only build the part that was needed. So basically, I don't remember the name. Schettino72 is his handle on GitHub. He's the do it author, and it's awesome. And Nikola is actually built as a collection of do it tasks. Nikola doesn't have a main, so to speak. It just creates a bunch of tasks, and then do it does what it has to do. And that's really cool. It works really well. And then for deployment and such, we went the easy way, which is, hey, give me a list of things to do and I will do it. It's basically a shell script.
That's one of the things that got me really interested in Nikola, actually, is my use case for static site generation is actually a little bit different from most. I don't generate the site on my development workstation and then upload the output. I do infrastructure as code work and a lot of chef stuff all day. And so I actually built a bunch of chef recipes and cookbooks that actually build the little, droplet or digital domain droplet and set something up where I check my latest changes out of GitHub every, 5, 10, 15 minutes. I forget what it was. And I generate my output directly on my site. So all I have to do is check my new posts into GitHub, and everything just magically appears out there on my site. And I liked the fact that with Nikola, with the do it idea, I could have some of that little bits of, deploy machinations that are currently in Chef. I could potentially take that out of Chef and write do it tasks to make the deployment, do the custom work that I wanted it to do. That's really interesting.
You can make it even easier. GitHub has webhooks. So if you run a really small service in your droplet that only listens on one URL, which is where the webhook is connected to, and then launches Nikola or Pelican or whatever, whenever there is an update on the repo, then that also works. And you have to do nothing.
And I'll add as well that if you're using Nginx as your proxy server, then you can actually just write that service in embedded Lua so that you don't have to have a separate application runtime, and you can just have it running inside of your host.
I didn't know that. Awesome.
Yeah, there's a framework called OpenResty that's built on top of that embedded Lua. You can do all kinds of interesting things with it.
So, is there any specific help that either of you would like to ask of our audience?
Themes.
Themes are always good.
Yeah, people who actually like HTML and CSS, please contact me.
Yeah, the other thing that I would add is, if folks are willing to help out just with reviewing issues and reviewing pull requests, this is a very significant task. Anyone who's ever managed a open source project of any moderate size can attest to the amount of time that it takes to stay on top of and review the large number of issues and pull requests that come in, and that's all great. It's a sign of a vibrant community. It's a sign of a popular project, and that's wonderful. It's I think disheartening for both the maintainers and people who perhaps come to the project for the first time to see a significant number of issues and pull requests that are sort of lacking attention. And to the extent that I think that someone who's not a official maintainer may feel like, well, it's not my place to comment on an issue or to comment on a pull request and to provide feedback on them. But I really couldn't disagree with that sentiment more strongly. I think that it's so highly valuable, it's not just assisting the maintainers. It makes the project so much more pleasant for everyone. So to the extent that folks are willing to help out when they can, that would be much, much appreciated.
So before we move to the picks, is there anything that either of you would like to add, or any questions that we didn't ask that you think we should have?
Well, you mentioned this, just kind of going back to this question of Markdown and its different variations. I think it's interesting that this idea that Jeff Atwood saw this problem and said, okay, well, why don't we combine our efforts and standardize Markdown. And the funny thing is there's an XKCD comic that talks about this. Like, we need to have a standard. And so someone, there's too many of these. There's, say that there's 15 different implementations. So we need to standardize. Someone writes a standard. Okay, well, now you have 16 standards instead of 15. And I think that that's what Common Mark in many ways has achieved. I don't really see it as the Markdown to rule them all. I look at it as yet another flavor of Markdown that's really no different than GitHub flavored Markdown or multi-Markdown or umpteen other different variants. The core of John Gruber's original Markdown, and the reason why I think he's been somewhat loath to change it, is that it does most things that someone wants to do. It doesn't mean that it does everything. It doesn't mean that there aren't ways of improving it or extending it, but it's a good core. And I think that that's why he's been content to say, like, this stands on its own, and I can write that standard Markdown, using links, making things bold, making things italic, headers, all the different sort of core components, and feel confident that that's going to render the same on all of these different flavors. And so really you choose, as the person who's trying to say, pick one, which one does the things that I want it to do. And I don't know that Common Mark has been successful in unifying Markdown under a single banner. And I don't know that it will. And I think that says a lot for standardization efforts in general. I think it's just sometimes there's a reason for that fragmentation. And I don't know that just saying like there should only be one, common Markdown is very realistic.
Yeah, I mean, consider things much smaller than Markdown. Typography. You mentioned about doing that sort of transformation as your reason to join Pelican. At one point, I decided to add typography support to Nikola, and there were 5 implementations. Pelican had a fork. There was the original fork that was abandoned. There was another one for, I don't know, for hide or whatever, and so on. So I contacted everybody and said, hey guys, let's merge all this back together. There was another typography for Django. And typography is really simple software. It's 5 functions, which are basically text replacements. And I couldn't get them all to agree.
It's funny that you mentioned typography because I was the one that forked it. I had been talking to Christian over time, and he had talked about transferring the project to me, and I said that would be great, and then I think he got really busy, and that didn't happen, and we needed it to do something that it didn't do, and so I eventually just said, okay, I don't feel like I have a choice here, and so I forked it, and then not soon afterward, thanks to Roberto, we were able to kind of get it all under one banner again, and that's sometimes you have happy endings like that, and sometimes
except for Django typography, that they are still forked.
Right. Yeah. I think that standardization just in general is a difficult thing to do. It doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile, but there are times where, as Roberto said, the more complex the particular thing you're trying to standardize is, the more difficulty you're likely to have in standardizing it.
And Markdown is like 2 orders of magnitude bigger than typography, so it's probably 1,000 times harder to do it. And nobody wants to do it. That's the main problem. I don't expect the guys in Haskell that write Pandoc are going to be really interested in making it fully compatible with Common Markdown because they don't really care, and so on. And nobody knows enough to patch every Markdown implementation because nobody knows how many they are. I mean, we have Misaka, which is written in Go, and so on. There's dozens. And they basically work. The difference between them is minor. It's, okay, this one generates paragraph inside lists, and this one doesn't. Well, who cares? It looks the same.
Right. Yeah. If you look at the Common Mark plugin for Pelican, I would say that, obviously I really don't have any way of measuring how widespread adoption of it is. But if I were to just take a guess based on, mentions in the GitHub issue tracker for Pelican, my guess is that less than 1% of Pelican users are using Common Mark.
Yeah, sounds right. I wrote a Common Mark plugin for Nikola. I don't think anybody used it because we have Python Markdown in core, so nobody sees the need to switch to Common Markdown.
Thank you both. So with that, I think we'll move into the picks. For my first pick today, I'm going to choose an Android application called Termux, which is an easy way to get a Linux shell environment set up without having to have root on your device or go through any process of creating a chroot environment. So definitely worth taking a look at that. My next pick is a project I came across recently called Magic Wormhole, which is a way to securely transfer files between 2 computers when there is an out-of-band communication happening. So a way for 2 people to share a password that can be used for generating the 2 endpoints and then transferring files directly between the 2 computers without necessarily being right next to each other, where a USB key is infeasible. The transfer doesn't necessarily warrant the complexity of setting up shared Dropbox folders or any of the other various ways that we have of transferring data. And for my last pick, I'm going to choose the Arrow library for Python, which is a unifying wrapper around the time and datetime and time delta libraries and just gives it a really nice syntax for dealing with time in Python. So, Chris, what have you got?
For my first pick, this book has been out literally since like the 90s. I don't forget the exact publication date, but it's so well written. I'm so impressed by it that I feel like it deserves a pick. It's the Emacs Lisp Introduction by the FSF. It is just a really beautifully written book that steps you through learning how to program in Emacs Lisp. It's definitely oriented towards new programmers who don't have a ton of experience, but as somebody who's been coding for quite a number of years, I can say it worked pretty well for me as well. It's really great. So that's my first pick. My second pick is 3D Cellular Automata in Minecraft, a first attempt. And this guy basically took the, Conway's Game of Life principles and implemented it as a Minecraft Java plugin. So the results were kind of interesting. It looked like something out of a science fiction movie. Good fun. My third and last pick is Prompt 2 by Panic Software. Those guys have been around for a very long time in the Mac and iOS space, and it shows with this product. It is a terminal emulator, basically, for your iPad or iPhone, and it is just so polished and works so well. It works great with an external keyboard, or even if you don't have an external keyboard, they have these sort of like on-the-go modifiable keys to add to the extra on-screen keyboard. So if you're working in Emacs or something like that, it makes it fairly straightforward, if not, amazingly comfortable to do. It's just a beautifully polished product and definitely worth a look if you have an iOS device and you do a lot of connecting to remote Unix boxes with SSH. And that's it for me. Justin, what do you have for us?
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't, throw out shameless plugs for monitorial.net, which is if you ever interact with any servers and you often wonder, like, do I have the latest security updates applied? Go there, put in your email address, and hit the button to be notified when it launches, which hopefully will launch later on this year. And the other project, as I mentioned, uprise.com, which is with 2 I's. If you go to uprise.com/join, you can do the same for Uprise to be notified about when we're ready to launch for our concert ticket thing. Okay, shameless plugs aside, my actual picks are ErgoDox. I don't know if you guys are as obsessed with keyboards as I am. I remember using a Apple Extended Keyboard 2. I'm probably along with Chris. I've been around long enough to have actually interacted with this keyboard from a long time ago and missed the sort of feel and the impact, texture, for lack of a better word, not to mention the sounds that it made. And so I really missed that. And so
You're not going to believe this, but I have one right in front of me right now. I'm typing.
I actually do believe it. That's fantastic. Somewhere in the move from one place to another, my original Extended Keyboard 2 got misplaced, which I'm sad about. But the good news is that I was trying to find a solution and a solution for a particular problem that I have, which is, think about how many times you hit the backspace key in a given day, right? I mean, it's something that we hit hundreds of times, a day, if not, thousands of times a week. And we hit it with like the weakest finger on our hand, our pinky. And so the ErgoDox is a way of, it's a kit. It's not, you don't really buy the finished keyboard, but it kind of comes with the printed circuit boards and the pieces, and then you solder the keys, onto the circuit board. And so it's obviously not for the faint of heart in terms of, you have to roll your sleeves up. But the cool thing that I like about it is the ability to use your thumbs for more things than just hitting the space bar and maybe, a modifier key. You can, I have it mapped, and you can customize every single key. You can make anything do, any key do whatever you want it to do. And I have it mapped so that I've got, the right thumb hits space, left thumb hits backspace. You can do all kinds of cool things like that. So if you want to check it out, it's called an ErgoDox. I also recently got a Jarvis bamboo sit stand desk from Ergo Depot. And I've been hunting around for a good, mechanized, adjustable standing desk for a long time and kind of hemmed and hawed about it. And I finally just decided that analysis paralysis was getting the better of me and just pulled the trigger on this particular desk. And I really like it. It's sturdy. It's really nice to look at. It's got presets, so I can push 1 and have it go up to standing, push 2, have it go down to seated. I'm not sure what I'll use 3 and 4 presets for, but so it's a great desk. You should check it out if you're trying to improve your health. I've sat in a chair immobile for decades, not realizing that this was not healthy, or at least not fully realizing the extent to which it's not healthy. So I'm really glad that now I've converted to standing 90% of the time. The other thing I'll throw at is Talkie. Skype is useful when you need to record a call. For any other time where I'm trying to have a conversation with someone across the interwebs, I'll almost always reach for Talkie.io. It's built using WebRTC. It's built into the most recent versions of Firefox and Chrome. I've had personally better luck with Firefox in terms of how reliable it is. It's not perfect. You're not going to get maybe as good an experience as you're going to get from a proprietary solution like Skype or Hangouts. But I find just the idea that it's this peer-to-peer web conferencing, screen sharing, video, audio that's built into the browser itself as a standard. Like that just really gets, it gets me excited, and it's only going to improve over time. So you should check that out. If you guys spend a lot of time in a terminal and you haven't looked at alternative shells, I would recommend giving it a try. I have been using the fish shell for a few years now, and I really dig it. And I just kind of take every opportunity I can to tell people about it, because they're like, well, why would I use anything other than Bash? And there's some cool things that fish can do just out of the box. I mean, you can use, ZSH and get some similar types of auto-completion and other goodies out of it, but you have to make it do that. You have to configure it to do those things. Whereas I find that the out-of-box experience with the fish shell is just better than any shell that I've ever used. I liked it enough that I wrote if you go to GitHub/JustinMayer/Tacklebox, you can check out a framework that I wrote for the fish shell that allows you to keep, custom functions and plugins and modules and share them. And there's just certain things that I found myself wanting to do across all the computers that I use. And so I just built something that kind of scratched my own itch. So if you find it useful, that's great. And one of the things that it comes with is virtual fish, which is a way of interacting with virtual environments in Python in a fish context. And I recently installed, just speaking of shells, the latest 3.0 public beta of iTerm. And I usually don't, when I'm talking about terminals usage, I usually don't go for betas of things. I like stability in my terminals. But they added some really, really cool features, things like shell integration. You can, if you have the shell integration set up on local and remote, you can even drag and drop files into your terminal and have it transmit that to your remote server and vice versa. And that's one of a dozen different cool things that this latest version of iTerm does. So if you're not afraid to try a public beta of iTerm, you should give it a spin. Last but not least, I'll throw out 3 just sort of lifestyle things. I'm really into craft beer. My favorite by far is Brother Thelonious. It is a Belgian darkish, amberish ale. It's just it's one of these things where I know that if I walk into a place and they happen to have it, I know I'm gonna be happy. I know I'm gonna order that, and I'm gonna be super, super excited.
I can second that. That's tasty stuff.
It's really good. It's just a go-to favorite. I also really like wine, and if you ever are up in the Napa area, there's a winery called Frog's Leap. They just make very good. They have a great location in Rutherford, and they just make really great, what I think are reasonably affordable wines, and they're wonderful. And very, very last is I recently went on a 2-month adventure in this past spring. Went to Japan to visit some friends, and then went to Europe and spoke at PyCon Italia, and just really met some great people. If you have a chance to go to Italy in general, I highly recommend it. If you have the opportunity to go, next spring for PyCon Italia, you'll have a great time. I've been to several different, PyCons, both the ones in North America and regional, and it was just a great experience. I met 2 people in particular, Flavio Percoco and Alessandra Regolini, who invited me to their house and had me, me and my fiance stay with them. These are people that I just met for a matter of a couple hours. And so we stayed with them for a number of days, and it was just so great to see the Python community in Italy being so warm and welcoming. So shout out to all the people in the Python community in Italy. You guys are doing a great job keeping the Python community strong. Anyway, I will relinquish the mic. Apologies for my for my long list of picks.
No worries. Roberto, what do you have for us?
Okay, let's see. First thing, my first pick is Neil Stephenson, writer. I'm sure most people listening to this already heard of him, but if you haven't, go read some of his books. You may start with, Cryptonomicon or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
Not only are they awesome, they are also really long, so you can enjoy the awesome for a long time. Second thing, a really small Python module, which I started using a couple of weeks ago and I love, which is called docopt, which is an argument parsing library, and there are no lack of those in Python. But this one is original in that you write the help, and then it parses the command line based on the help you wrote, which means the help is correct, which is always nice. And the third thing, I was in the US last year, and sorry for this, it's going to be really common for you guys, but I tried some strange food there that I liked. First time I ever tried fried pickles. I have had pickles, we have pickles here, but nobody had ever apparently thought of frying them, and it's a great idea. And nothing else, just that, just be happy. Oh, one more thing, shameless plug from myself. In Argentina, we have a Python users group, which is called PR. PR. I don't know how to say it in English because it's not English. We do all sorts of events, and we keep them all free. We have a PyCon, which is totally free. It's going to be in a lovely place called Mendoza later this year. People who are interested in Python and going to the mountains and things like that, it's a great opportunity. Place is cheap, and the conference is free. So pick up a flight over there and go to it. And in 2 weeks, there is another event that's called PyCamp, where about 40 of us get locked down in a hotel in the middle of nowhere with free food and free internet and nothing else. So usually good stuff comes out of it. It's a really cool event, and I would love to see things like that in other places. So think about it, and it's a lot of fun. And that's it.
Sounds like a good time to me.
Yeah.
So we'd like to thank you both very, very much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Yeah, I'd like to second those thanks. It's been a lot of fun, very interesting and informative. I really appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day. So for anybody who wants to keep track of what you guys are up to and the Pelican and Nikola projects or get in touch with you, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Sure. You can go to getpelican.com if you want to learn more about Pelican. I'm available at justinmayer.com if you want to reach out on a more personal level.
The same thing for Nikola, just go to getnikola.com and just go to either the forum or the mailing list or whatever. Just go there. Don't contact me personally because I'm probably not the right person to help you. But if you go there to the list or whatever, I will see it.
All right. Well, thank you again very much, and I hope you both enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.